Hey parents, thank you for checking out this week's 2-minute video telling you about what we talked about in chapel for the second week here at school. As I already told you in our first parent page video, the theme of the year is Jesus changes everything. Now in the first week we took a look at just a fresh look, well, who is Jesus? What did he do and what does he do in our lives? And basically we said, well, Jesus is unique. He was a unique rabbi. He was a unique teacher. He had very unique teachings. But more importantly, he was unique in his promise that he will always be with us. So last week we took a fresh look at, well, who is Jesus and this whole idea of Jesus changes everything. This week we took a look at, well, if that's who Jesus is, well, what does he do? And so under this umbrella of how Jesus changes everything, from week to week, we're going to be taking a look at examples in the Bible of how he shows up in people's lives and changes everything. And so this week's example was taken from John chapter 4, the woman at the well. And so I would like to encourage you, go ahead, maybe brush up on the story, look at John chapter 4 and the woman at the well, so that you could have a conversation with your students and say, hey, I heard in chapel this week that you looked at the story of the woman at the well. And you can have a little bit of context as you would have a conversation with your student. But just so you know what we talked about, when Jesus shows up here with this woman at the well, there were kind of three big points. The first is, John says in verse 4, it says that he had to go through Samaria. And we talked about how really that's not true. Jesus didn't have to go through Samaria. He chose to go through Samaria because he wanted to have an experience with this woman. And so I think that is something to talk about with your kid. Jesus does things so that we can have an experience with him. So what is it that he's doing right now? Maybe for your student, or maybe for you, or friends, or whatever. And just kind of wrestle with this idea about how Jesus does things specifically so that we can experience with him. The second thing we talked about is, as we read through the story, Jesus very clearly knew a lot about this woman. And many times when we know things about each other, we instantly start to judge. And one thing that's interesting is that Jesus doesn't judge this woman. He just lets her know how much he really knows her. He brings up things about her past. He brings out things that really no one should know but herself. And Jesus says, no, I know all these things about you. And the idea behind this is how much we are actually really just known by God, how much Jesus knows us and doesn't necessarily show up to judge and condemn us, but to let us know how much he knows us. And the idea was, when we're known, that shows how much we're loved. And when we're loved, that brings out how much we're known. And so the idea was, to be known is to be loved, and to be loved is to be known. And so I would encourage you to talk to your kid about that, and like, what does that look like in your family's life, and at the just daily living at school and at home. And then finally, the third point was the reaction. Here, this woman, as we go through the story, she knows a lot about the Messiah. She talks to Jesus about the Messiah. The thing that's interesting is that she didn't recognize the Messiah when he was sitting right there in front of her. And so there was this whole idea that we talked about, as how there is a difference from knowing about Jesus to actually knowing Jesus. And in this story, Jesus invites this woman. He specifically is there so that they can have this experience, so that he can let this woman know how much he knows and loves her, and deeply wants this person, in this story, the woman, to know who he is. And this comes out in the text. Don't just know about me, but know who I am. And so that was the challenge. And so I would like to invite you to have this conversation at home. What does it mean to not just know about Jesus, but to actually know him?